Hello, it's so nice to be here with you all, and thank you all for coming. It's exciting to see interest growing every year on climate and health in Montana. I'm just going to introduce our two next speakers who will be talking about environmental stewardship related to anesthesia care in perioperative areas. And then they'll each present for about 20 minutes and then have an opportunity for questions. So they are Dr. Piotr Michalowski and Dr. Brian Harrington, both from Billings and from St. Vincent, who have been in practice for a while, and they will tell you all about that. So welcome, whoever'd like to go first.
Okay, well, thank you, Beth. Let me see if I can figure it out here. First of all, thanks for, it's great to see so many people here, and I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you, Lori. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. As was mentioned, I'm Brian Harrington. I'm an anesthesiologist, and I've been here in Billings for over 33 years, so quite a little while. And just a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, there's no conflicts of interest or disclosures to make, and there will be CME provided for this activity. And we're going to be talking about health decarbonization, lessons from the OR. And the learning objectives will be that we'll see how the operating rooms contribute to greenhouse gases, as well as just general environmental degradation. We're going to talk about how we can decrease OR contributions to greenhouse gases and other pollutants. And then Piotr's going to talk about how to reduce greenhouse gases specifically. So let's start at the beginning. Okay. So I want to emphasize that when we talk about the climate and we talk about our environment and health effects, it's a lot more than just carbon emissions. And it's been called carbon tunnel vision. So hopefully it's more about, we're going to talk today more than just carbon emissions, which sort of get the lion's share of our attention with climate change. But really there's a lot of other things. There's things like health, there's ecotoxicity, water. All of these factors play into this equation. And I think we need to consider all of these. One of the papers that I'll be citing a little later says that, you know, while all eyes have been focused on climate change and carbon, plastics have become our next environmental catastrophe. And I'm going to be talking today mostly about plastics and pharmaceutical pollutants. So to start at the beginning, let's see here. Okay, here we go. So we've got three primary states of matter: solids, liquids, and gases. I'm going to be talking about solids and liquids. Piotr's going to be talking about gases, and that's how we separated out our assignments here. So let's talk about solids and liquids. And I don't think it's a big secret that we generate a lot of solid waste in our operating theaters. And I think those of us who are there every day, we get a little desensitized to it. And it's almost like we don't really even see it. But you bring somebody who isn't used to coming into the OR and show them how much waste we produce on a single case, it's astounding. And it really impressed this lady right here. She's a Dutch artist, and she made this piece of artwork from all the solid waste that was generated from her single breast surgery. And this was actually featured on the cover of our primary journal, Anesthesiology, in December of 2021. And I think it's a great way to make a statement. And it's entitled, "This is the waste of one operation, my operation." Well, let's take a little closer look at solid waste in the OR. There we go. So hospitals generate about 30 pounds of waste per hospital bed per day. So that's quite a little bit of garbage. Operating rooms, although they have a small physical footprint, they have an incredibly large environmental footprint. And operating rooms produce about 30% of all hospital waste. And my home, the operating room, which this is what my cockpit looks like on a daily basis, anesthesia is considered to be a real carbon hotspot. And Piotr's going to talk about mostly why it's a carbon hotspot. But it's worth noting that over 25% of all surgical waste is generated through anesthesia. And a high proportion of these are single-use plastics. And as I said, I'm going to focus on plastics today. And as I think back over my 30+ year career, I see a lot of things that used to be reusable and have been replaced with disposable plastic versions of themselves. And so here we have a laryngoscope handle and blade. We've got pulse oximeter probes. We've got oxygen masks, blood pressure cuffs. We've even got fiber optic bronchoscopes. And all of these now are disposable items, and they all used to be reusable. There we go. If you analyze disposable equipment, you'll see that disposable equipment has, generally speaking, lower acquisition costs, but it tends to be less labor intensive, uses less water, but has a much greater environmental footprint. And I'm going to take my favorite example of the environmental footprint, which has been looked at very extensively, and that is the laryngeal mask airway. And most people here are probably familiar with the laryngeal mask airway. This is a airway device that kind of just slips into the throat and sits right above your vocal cords there, right above the glottis, and provides us with a hands-free airway. This is what it looks like. This is a reusable one here. And this was developed in the mid-'80s by an anesthesiologist, Archie Brain, and great name for a researcher. And anyway, this was originally came out in the United States in about 1991. And it was this reusable version that was marketed. And it was about 10 years later that they started really pushing the disposable laryngeal mask airway. And if you're going to use a reusable laryngeal mask airway, like this one here, it needs to be collected. They try to mark them so that you're not going to confuse it. See how this has a green on here so that you can see that this is not a disposable one. So the ones that are green, if you have, it's kind of really hard, impractical really, to have reusable ones and disposable ones in the same facility, because people will throw away the reusable ones and try to reuse the disposable ones. But the reusable ones, they all need to be collected, rinsed and scrubbed, repackaged, they're steam autoclaved, and then they need to be tracked for how many times they've been used. And so typically you can get about 40 to 60 uses out of one of these reusable laryngeal mask airways. But this takes probably about 10 minutes of anesthesia tech's time. And so if you're somebody in the hospital and you're talking about purchasing laryngeal mask airways, this is kind of what your equation looks like. You've got your disposable versus your reusable. Here's your disposable. It comes in individually packaged and you use it and then you throw it away. And here's our reusable, and it's packaged, it's used, and then it gets washed, autoclaved, and you can continue to do that 40 to 60 times, and then eventually it just gets thrown out. And if you look at the price tag on these, the acquisition cost, I just priced this out for a disposable LMA, is about $6.24 right now. And the reusable is around $100. And so when you consider the labor as well, it's not too surprisingly, I just made this number up, but it's basically a push as far as the cost goes. It's about the same, and yet you're not tying up people's time. And it's seems like the disposable just seems a lot easier, doesn't it? But what we fail to recognize here is that there's an entire product life cycle. And so what we're looking at for the last slide I showed you was we're really looking at using it and then either throwing it away or recycling. We're looking at this part of this product lifestyle, but actually we need to consider, if we're talking about the environment, the whole package here, we need to talk about the raw materials, the manufacturing, the transportation, the utilization, disposal, etc. There's a whole product lifestyle. And the reason I picked the LMA for this example is because it's been looked at very, very closely. And so this is the whole equation for an LMA. And Jody Sherman at Yale has done a really nice job at looking at this. And so if you look at, this is your disposable LMA. It starts with raw materials, gets manufactured in China, it gets shipped, package shipped. And then you can see here's your reusable, kind of the same thing. But when you think about it, you're going to make 40 of these for every one of these. You're going to ship 40 of these for every one of these. You're going to throw away 40 disposable ones for every reusable one that you use. And so if you look at this analytically, as Dr. Sherman and colleagues have done, you can see that the reusable here in the light blue compared to the disposable in the dark blue is actually more environmentally friendly for virtually everything. The only thing that it would be even close to is eutrophication, which is has to do with the washing and the nitrogen and phosphorus that we put into our water. But you can see that global warming, acidification, human health effects, cancer, non-cancer, air pollutants, much lower for the reusable device, ecotoxicity, smog, water intake, ozone depletion. The reusable ones are much more environmentally responsible. And well, how did they do this? If you looked at these devices, they look virtually the same, don't they? And they've made it so that the disposable ones kind of have the same feel, and you kind of just get used to it. So they're just a small difference. I would say most people would say the reusable ones are a little smoother, but the disposable ones have gotten really good. And here's how they did it, though. They took a product that was 92% silicone, which is not a plastic. It's more of a rubber material. And they replaced it essentially with plastic, polyvinyl chloride. And so these disposable LMAs are essentially all plastic now. So, well, here's what's happening with plastics. And if we look at the total production of plastics over time, it began in the 1950s, and it's just going up exponentially. We're in the 2024 here. But here's the big problem is, first of all, about 2/3 of all plastics, if you look at the greater than 9,200 million tons of plastic that have been produced since the 1950s, 2/3 of those plastics have either been thrown away or incinerated. And you can see that less than 8% have actually been recycled. As a matter of fact, there's a lot more plastic that's been incinerated than recycled. So theoretically, plastic is recyclable, right? And we're sort of being led to think that plastic's recyclable. It's nice to see that things are so well labeled here. This is from medical equipment that I've used in the operating theater. And you can see that things are very well labeled, but the reality of the situation is virtually no plastic from the operating room gets recycled for various reasons. And some of those reasons are lack of facilities, especially you can think about it here in Montana. You know, where are we going to get certain types of plastic recycled? There are issues with the type of plastics, and they will mix different types of plastics depending on what the features you have. Like if you have an LMA, it's several different types of plastic that are used in that, and they can't all be recycled the same. And plus, anything that touches a patient is considered to be contaminated and needs to be treated different than a regular recycled item. So even though it's nice, you can see this is a nice article from Anesthesiology just a couple of years ago. And you can see that there are these 7 different labeled types of plastics, and almost all of them are theoretically recyclable, but really nothing gets recycled. Well, let's take a little closer look at this production of plastics over time. And you can see that here's here's the plastics that are being generated in the black line. And you can see, like, we're here at 2024, this is going up exponentially. And you might be curious as far as, well, what's driving this? Well, it's the same global petrochemical companies that, like ExxonMobil, that are, they're the petroleum companies, and they're pivoting from fossil-based fuels to fossil-based plastics. And that's what's happening here. And unfortunately, you can see that the amount that's thrown away it looks like it's kind of flattening out just a little bit, but it's mostly because we're incinerating more in the green, not because we're recycling that much more. So we have a great potential to possibly do a better job with these plastics. Well, it kind of raises the question, what's really wrong with plastics besides generating a lot of garbage? Well, I think the answer at this point is maybe everything. So, so what happens to plastics? Here's my little prop. Is if this somehow makes it into a body of water, well, what happens? Well, this cap, which is made out of a different material, ends up washing up on shore. This does not. This thin plastic, this gets broken down right away because of mechanical agitation, because of sunlight, and it turns into microplastics and nanoplastics. And so this is just this is a little busy, but just indulge me for a minute. You can see that here's microplastics. They really started about 1 millimeter and go down to a micrometer in size. And you can see that you can actually, if you look at the way that you can study things like plastics, you can actually study some microplastics with the naked eye if they're greater than a millimeter, but you can just use a regular optical microscope if they're greater than 100 micrometers. But as you get into smaller and smaller pieces of plastic, if they're less than a micrometer, they become nanoplastics. And you can see that nanoplastics, actually, if you get down to this 100 nanometer, these can actually cross the blood-brain barrier. They cross into cells. These are smaller than things like asbestos flakes, things like particulate matter in the air. These plastics get very, very small, and they've been found everywhere. As you can see from this article here, this is from Nature. Microplastics are everywhere, but are they harmful? And they were asking this just a couple of years ago. And so microplastics and nanoplastics really have been found everywhere. They've been found at the top of Mount Everest. They've been found at the bottom of the Marianas Trench. They've been found in breast milk. They've been found, you name it, in the placenta, everywhere. But are they harmful? Well, there's been a growing body of evidence that indicates that these are harmful. And so if you look at exposure to micro and nanoplastics in combination with a lot of these other chemicals that get put in there, and a lot of these are those forever chemicals that you hear about in the news. These are things that lend plastics things like their hardness or their malleability, their ability to be molded, things like that. But there's a growing body of evidence that both in vivo and in vitro, there are harmful effects. And these are some of the main mechanisms, particularly for cardiovascular toxicity. But we've known that high exposures, like in, say, a plastics factory, we've known for the last 50 years that things like high exposures to polyvinyl chloride cause hepatic tumors, things like that. But those aren't normal exposures, are they? That's kind of exceptional. What we really want to know is this incidental exposure, particularly to micro and nanoplastics, does that have harmful effects on human health? And it looks like it probably does have some cardiovascular toxicity. And this is the first article. It came out last month in the New England Journal. It's the first article that really points to a human health effect of microplastics. And what they did, the Marfella and colleagues are in Italy. They took a very common procedure, which is the carotid endarterectomy, where you open up the carotid artery and take out an obstructing plaque, a piece of plaque and clot and all other stuff. And then they looked at this plaque. They did it on 257 consecutive patients. And then they looked at this plaque using the really like high microscopic visualization that is very extremely expensive, as I showed you before. But they were looking for microplastics and nanoplastics, and here's what they found. First of all, here's your 257 patients. 150, 60% of patients had micro and nanoplastics in the plaque that was removed from their neck. 40% did not have the microplastics. And then they just followed these patients. They didn't do anything. They just passively followed them. But they were looking for these endpoint events. They were looking for myocardial infarctions, strokes, or death from any cause. And you can see the patients, if you follow these out 3 years, 36 months, you can see the patients without micro and nanoplastics have a much lower rate of these endpoints than the patients with micro and nanoplastics. And we've always considered plaque in the carotid to be somewhat of a surrogate for, say, plaque in the coronary arteries, for example, and plaque in other vessels throughout the head. And so this is really the first direct human evidence that we've seen that micro and nanoplastics really have a human health effect. Let's move on. Let's talk about, we're gonna change pace. We're gonna talk about liquids. This is East Rosebud Lake in the Beartooth, and I'm going to focus on pharmaceutical waste, and we're going to kind of just hone in on the one chemical that we see in the operating theater that I think is probably most concerning at this point, and that is propofol. And if anybody's ever been in an OR, they know that we draw up a lot of drugs and don't use them, and we throw them away or dispose of them in some way. But you can see this is a study where they looked at the pharmaceuticals that were drawn up, and typically you'll draw up an entire ampule of whatever you're using because they're single dose vials typically, and then you'll use what you need and you'll end up discarding the rest. And you can see that propofol actually accounts for almost half of the drugs that were dispensed, and 32%, a third of the propofol that was drawn up ended up wasted. So I want you to remember that. We're going to focus a little bit on propofol. Now, of course, it doesn't take much imagination to imagine how if you have hospitals and people are squirting the propofol down the sink or putting it in the garbage, it eventually makes it into our water system and our drinking water. And if you look at this is a really nice study of hospital effluents. So they were looking for active pharmaceuticals in the wastewater from hospitals. And what they did is, this is actually 4 different ways of looking at that, at active pharmaceuticals in the wastewater. There's this occurrence, persistence, bioaccumulation, and toxicity. This is a more refined look at that, saying this is the environmental risk assessment for the various active pharmaceutical ingredients. And then this is sort of a composite. And I'll have you notice that there's propofol right there. It's, no matter how you want to measure it, it is there in the pharmaceutical, active pharmaceuticals in the hospital effluents. And so that's not really very surprising, is it? I mean, if you're in the OR, you see that we throw these drugs away all the time. Well, is propofol bad in the water? Well, we have every reason to think yes. And so if you look at the persistence, bioaccumulation, and toxicity of propofol, you can see that propofol does not biodegrade in nature. And in order to get rid of it, you need to incinerate it at greater than 1,000 degrees centigrade for greater than 2 seconds. It's considered to have a very high bioaccumulation potential, and it has been shown to be very toxic to aquatic organisms. And if you give it all of these drugs are given a score, a persistence, bioaccumulation, toxicity score. The rating goes from 0, not harmful at all, to 9, extremely harmful. It's a 6. And so really the take home from here is that you need to put, if you're going to dispose of propofol, it needs to go into one of these canisters that actually, we use what's called a cactus, and the drugs go in there, they get bound to like a styrofoam type material, and then they get incinerated. And that's the only way to get rid of propofol. But the big question is, does propofol harm human health? I think we're looking for the next study, like they did in Italy of the carotid endarterectomies. I think we're looking for a study that maybe looks at a potential health effect of propofol. So it's going to take some innovative research, I think, to study this. So one thing, as if you didn't have enough to worry about, there are some theoretical reasons to think that microplastics and these active pharmaceutical agents are actually somehow tied together. And so if you look at the chemical properties of microplastics and pharmaceuticals, there's a reason to think that these microplastics can actually act as a vector. They can carry high amounts of active pharmaceuticals into living organisms. And so this is very concerning. Well, this is all theoretical at this point, but it's fairly new, a new way of thinking about this problem. So what are the lessons here? I'm supposed to make sure we have some lessons. The first is that I think consideration of product costs must extend beyond acquisition and include comprehensive life cycle assessments. Second, I think that recent evidence indicates that much greater attention to the human health hazards of plastics is warranted. And I think that initial study, that's just the beginning. We're going to start seeing more and more people looking at this more closely. And pharmaceuticals call for more appropriate and deliberate disposal than is currently practiced. And I just want to leave you with one last thought. I appreciate the Native American introduction today. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Chief Seattle. We don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. And I think that resonates with anyone who has children, cares about children. So, all right, that's it for me. Thank you.